Did you know that without Eric Bristow, darts history might have looked completely different? No Phil Taylor, no modern PDC dominance, no global rise of the sport. Bristow wasn't just the best of his era, he was the blueprint. He played the game with swagger. In an era where darts was more about personality than precision, Bristow had both. And when he was at his peak, he wasn't just winning, he was shaping the future of the game. So today, we're diving back into the golden years to find out just how good prime Eric Bristow really was. Let's get into it. Eric Bristow didn't just win, he suffocated the competition. Before a single dart was thrown, he had already occupied space in his opponent's mind, setting up camp with that knowing smirk and an air of inevitability. His confidence wasn't just unshakable, it was infectious. If you weren't careful, you'd start believing in it yourself. He moved at his own rhythm, deliberate yet unbothered, as if the match was a formality, but winning was just one part of it. Once you see the way he toyed with some of the biggest names in the sport, you'll understand why no lead was ever safe against him. The slight pause before he stepped up, the way he leaned in like he was letting the dartboard in on a private joke. Every movement was designed to remind you that this was his game, and when the time came to close, he wasn't just accurate, he was ruthless. Doubles didn't stand a chance. He had the kind of composure that made other players nervous in the quiet moments. The way he'd watch, arms crossed as you lined up a crucial shot. No words needed, just that unbearable silence stretching longer than it should. If you missed, you weren't getting another chance. Where others faltered, Bristow fed off pressure. It sharpened him. He played like he was daring you to find a flaw in his game, fully aware you wouldn't. For nearly a decade, he didn't just dominate darts, he owned it. Winning a world title is tough. Winning 2, that puts you among the all-time greats. But winning 5 when darts was still carving out its identity as a professional sport, that was unheard of. And yet, by the time Eric Bristow was done, that's exactly what he had. 5 world championships, each one solidifying his status as the sport's first true superstar. His trophy cabinet was obscene. World Masters titles, countless major wins, victories in every format imaginable. But numbers alone don't tell the full story. Bristow controlled eras. He wasn't a player who had a few great seasons. He defined the 1980s. There were years where the conversation wasn't who would win, but whether anyone could even challenge him. Take his dominance on the biggest stage. The 1984 final against Dave Whitcomb, a 4-set sweep that felt more like a coronation than a contest. The 1986 final against Bob Anderson, another masterclass. When Bristow was locked in, there was nothing to be done.
This man has nerves of steel, looking at double top for the title.
Even in the rare moments he lost, it felt like a temporary glitch rather than a turning point. He wasn't the type to fade away. He regrouped, came back stronger, and reminded everyone that his throne wasn't up for grabs just yet. By the time the decade was over, Bristow was a multiple-time world champion and the absolute gold standard. Every player that came after him had to measure themselves against his shadow, and for most of them, that shadow was just too big to escape. His gamesmanship was legendary. Against Jockey Wilson, he'd linger behind him, forcing Wilson to take an extra step forward before throwing. Against John Lowe, he'd deliberately slow the pace, dragging out the tension just enough to break the rhythm. Sometimes he'd just stare, not aggressively, not confrontationally, just enough to make you wonder what he was thinking. And in darts, once you start thinking, you're already losing. But the real trick, he made you doubt yourself. You'd second guess your doubles, overcompensate on your trebles, and before you knew it, you were watching him clean up the match. Now here's the twist. Bristow knew how to break everyone else, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. Because when the collapse finally came, it wasn't another player who took him down. It was something far worse. His own body. In the late 1980s, Bristow developed a condition that, for a dart player, was nothing short of catastrophic: dartitis. A sudden involuntary loss of control over throwing mechanics. One day, the fluid, precise motion he had repeated thousands of times without thought became a battle against his own hand. A simple release turned into hesitation, his wrist locking up mid-throw like a faulty mechanism. At first, people didn't know what to make of it. Here was Bristow, a man who had dominated the sport for a decade, suddenly pausing before releases, adjusting his stance, visibly thinking about his throw, something he never did before. Opponents who once feared him started sensing weakness. The same players who had spent years being dismantled by his confidence now watched as doubt crept into his game. For the first time, Eric Bristow looked human. It didn't happen overnight, but the decline was undeniable. He was still good, very good, but no longer untouchable. And in darts, where precision is everything, even the smallest hesitation can be the difference between dominance and mediocrity.
The game you love doing, all of a sudden you can't do anymore, and then you're thinking, well, I might not be able to do exhibitions here. So all of a sudden, what do I do at the age of 30, whatever? Become a postman?
By the early 1990s, a new generation was rising. Phil Taylor, Bristow's own protege, was beginning to assert himself. Taylor didn't just play like the future, he played like a man who had spent years studying under a master and was now surpassing him. Bristow fought. He tried different grips, different rhythms, anything to overcome the dartitis, and on sheer determination alone, he still managed to stay competitive. But the aura, the untouchable presence, that was fading. The psychological edge he had over his rivals had flipped. Now he was the one being studied, he was the one opponents felt they could beat. The moment that symbolized the shift came in 1990, when Bristow faced Taylor in the BDO World Championship final. The ultimate full-circle moment. Taylor, the man Bristow had mentored and funded, was now the one standing across from him, ready to take his place at the top. And the match wasn't even close. Taylor destroyed him 6-1, and in that moment, it was clear. The Bristow era was officially over. He had built a dynasty, he had dominated a decade, but darts had moved forward, and for the first time in his career, Eric Bristow was chasing, not leading. Most players, when their prime is over, fade into the background. Their names become statistics, their records eventually surpassed. But Eric Bristow wasn't just another champion, he was the foundation. Even after his decline, his influence never left the game. You could see it in the players who came after him, the way they carried themselves, the confidence they projected. Bristow set the standard for how to win. The swagger, the mind games, the ironclad belief that the match was over before it even began. That wasn't just his strategy, it became the template for future greats. And nowhere was his influence stronger than in Phil Taylor. Bristow built Taylor. He saw raw talent, backed it with his own money, and turned a factory worker from Stoke into the most dominant player the sport had ever seen. When Taylor dethroned Bristow in 1990, it was the end of one era and the start of a new one. Without Bristow, there's no Phil Taylor, and without Taylor, darts as we know it today doesn't exist. But Bristow's impact was cultural. Before him, darts was a pub game, played by blue-collar guys for small purses. By the time he was done, it was a televised spectacle with real money, real stakes, and a real future. He made people care. His brashness, his presence, the way he carried himself, it turned darts into entertainment. He was the first real star of the sport, and even in retirement, his personality never dulled. Whether it was commentary, media work, or just stirring the pot at tournaments, Bristow remained a towering figure. He didn't do humble, he didn't do quiet, and that's exactly why people still talked about him. So, how good was prime Eric Bristow? The titles, the dominance, the aura, it all speaks for itself. But the real answer is simpler. Darts wouldn't be what it is today without him. Because as legendary as Bristow was, his biggest impact wasn't just his own success, it was what came next. Phil Taylor was a monster of Bristow's own making, trained, funded, and sharpened by the crafty Cockney himself. So if you thought Bristow was dominant, wait until you see what prime Phil Taylor did to the sport. His records weren't just impressive, they were terrifying. Click here to find out just how unstoppable the power really was.